I never imagined that firing one cocky American college kid would cost me an entire billion-dollar empire. But on that humid July afternoon in 2023, I did exactly that and set in motion the coldest, most surgical revenge I have ever witnessed. My name is Darius Voss. At 67, I had built Voss Petrochem from a single tanker lease in the Persian Gulf into a $4.2 billion refining and trading operation with terminals from Rotterdam to Singapore. I kept dual citizenship, an American passport in my safe, and a sprawling waterfront estate outside Houston where I spent most summers. My board loved the margins I delivered. My 2 adult children in Tehran loved the wire transfers. And I loved control. The kid's name was Ethan Caldwell, 23. Chemical engineering senior from Texas A&M on a summer internship I had approved as a favor to a Houston lobbying firm. He showed up the first day in pressed khakis and a company polo, laptop bag slung like a badge of honor. Within 48 hours, he was already questioning my loading schedules in front of senior engineers, citing some open-source simulation he claimed proved we were losing $11,400 a day in vapor loss at the Galveston terminal. I laughed it off at the time. Vapor loss was a rounding error in a $900 million quarterly throughput. But Ethan kept pushing spreadsheets across the conference table during our weekly ops review, eyes bright with that particular American certainty that data always trumps decades of gut instinct. By week 4, the whispers had started. My VP of operations, a man who had survived 3 wars and 2 divorces, pulled me aside in the hallway outside my glass office and muttered that the intern had somehow gained read-only access to our legacy SCADA system and was running overnight Monte Carlo analyses on every crude batch we lifted. I told him to pull the kid's badge. Enough was enough. On Friday, July 28th at 4:17 p.m., I walked into the bullpen, stood over Ethan's desk, and said the words myself. "You're done here. Pack your things. Security will escort you out." I did not raise my voice. I did not explain. I simply watched the color drain from his face, watched him close his laptop with shaking fingers, and felt the small, satisfying click of restored order. He did not beg. He did not argue. He simply looked up at me with something that was not quite anger, more like a quiet recalibration, and said, "I'll remember this moment, Mr. Voss." Then he stood, slung that same laptop bag over his shoulder, and walked out between 2 security guards without another word. I slept well that night. Monday morning, the markets opened flat. My daughter called from Tehran to complain about her new Range Rover's lease payment, and life continued exactly as it should. Until it didn't. 6 weeks later, my general counsel walked into my office carrying a single manila envelope thick enough to need 2 rubber bands. Inside were SEC Form 13D filings, a freshly executed irrevocable trust document, and a 47-page forensic audit prepared by a boutique firm in Austin whose name I had never heard. The cover letter was short, typed on plain white paper, no letterhead. It read, "You fired the wrong intern." What followed was the most elegant financial assassination I have ever seen. Ethan had not gone home to lick his wounds. While I was still congratulating myself on reasserting authority, he had spent the next 36 hours in a 24-hour Kinko's off I-45, printing every public filing Voss Petrochem had ever submitted, cross-referencing tanker manifests with satellite AIS data he pulled from free maritime trackers, and mapping every dollar of the $312 million in consulting fees my brother-in-law had siphoned through 3 layered shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Dubai. He had not needed my internal systems. Everything he used was public, or semi-public if you knew where to look, and had the obsessive patience of a broke engineering student with nothing left to lose. By week 8, he had incorporated a Delaware LLC called Caldwell Recovery Partners, with $1,200 of his own savings and a $50,000 personal loan from his retired Marine father. He then filed a detailed whistleblower submission with the SEC under the Dodd-Frank Act, attaching 1,847 pages of exhibits. The submission triggered an immediate informal inquiry that, because of the dollar amounts involved, escalated within days to a full enforcement investigation. But that was only the opening move. While the SEC was still scheduling interviews, Ethan quietly approached 3 of my largest institutional investors, the same pension funds and family offices that had backed my last 2 bond issuances. He presented them with a 112-slide deck titled Voss Petrochem, Hidden Governance Failures and Undisclosed Related Party Transactions. Slide 47 contained a color-coded org chart showing how my sister's husband had routed $87.4 million through a Bahamian entity called Gulf Horizon Trading Limited, then cycled it back as performance bonuses to 3 board members who happened to be my golfing partners. Slide 89 showed bank statements proving those same board members had voted to approve a $240 million credit facility renewal the very week the transfers cleared. The investors did not call me. They called their lawyers. By October, the boardroom had become a war zone of emergency meetings. My general counsel was burning through billable hours faster than I could sign checks. I still thought I could contain it. I offered Ethan a 7-figure settlement through back channels. The response came in the form of a single text message from an unknown number. The number you are trying to reach has already been paid in full by the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. Then came the real blade. Ethan had spent part of his internship quietly documenting chain of custody issues with 3 specific crude cargoes we had imported from sanctioned Iranian fields through a Maltese front company. The documentation was meticulous. Timestamps, vessel names, bill of lading numbers, even photos of the forged certificates of origin taken with his phone while no one was watching. Under U.S. sanctions law, each violation carried a base penalty of $1 million per day per violation, and because the cargoes had cleared U.S. waters, the statute of limitations had not even begun to run. The Department of Justice received an anonymous package on November 3rd. By Thanksgiving, my Houston headquarters was crawling with FBI agents carrying subpoenas. My private jet was grounded. My U.S. bank accounts were frozen pending forfeiture review. I watched my net worth evaporate in real time on Bloomberg terminals. $4.2 billion became $2.9, then $1.7, then $840 million as trading partners invoked material adverse change clauses and walked away from contracts. My daughter stopped answering my calls. My son-in-law in Tehran began quietly transferring his own assets into his mother's name. The final humiliation arrived on a gray Monday in February 2024. I was summoned to a settlement conference in a nondescript federal building downtown. Ethan was there, not as a plaintiff, but as the government's star cooperating witness. He sat across the long mahogany table in the same pressed khakis he had worn the day I fired him, laptop closed, hands folded, looking 15 years older and completely at peace. My lawyers slid a 63-page consent decree across the table. In exchange for not facing criminal charges personally, I would surrender 68% of my equity in Voss Petrochem to a court-appointed receiver. The company would be restructured under new management. I would be barred for life from serving as an officer or director of any U.S.-listed entity. And I would pay a civil penalty of $312 million, the exact amount my brother-in-law had diverted, plus interest. I signed with a hand that no longer felt like mine. As the meeting adjourned, Ethan stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked around the table until he was directly in front of me. He did not gloat. He simply looked me in the eyes and said the only words he had spoken to me since the day I fired him. "You taught me something valuable that afternoon, Mr. Voss. Never underestimate what a nobody with nothing left to lose can do with 6 weeks, a library card, and public data." Then he walked out. I still own the estate outside Houston. The fountains still run, the bourbon still tastes the same. But every morning when I open my laptop, the first thing I see is the new ticker symbol for what used to be my company, now trading under new ownership at $47.82 a share, up 11% on news of improved compliance and governance. And somewhere in Austin or New York or wherever Ethan Caldwell decided to finish his degree, I know he is watching the same screen, smiling that quiet, recalibrated smile, because he did not just get revenge. He took the entire boardroom, the balance sheet, and $1 billion of my life's work, and he did it without ever raising his voice. He simply opened the manila envelope, and the empire fell. I spent the next 41 days in a fog of bourbon and conference calls that went nowhere. My general counsel billed me $187,000 in December alone, most of it for motions that were denied before the ink dried. Every morning I woke to fresh alerts on my phone. Another trading partner invoking force majeure. Another institutional holder dumping blocks of shares on the open market. Another reporter from the Journal sniffing around the Galveston terminal with a photographer in tow. I told myself it was temporary. Markets overreact. Regulators move slow. A man with my resources could always find a back door. Then the second manila envelope arrived. This one was delivered by a process server at 6:12 a.m. on a Tuesday while I was still in my robe, staring at the Houston skyline from the master suite. The return address was a P.O. box in College Station. Inside were 214 pages of color-coded bank records, wire confirmations, and a 19-page affidavit sworn under penalty of perjury by Ethan Caldwell himself. Every line item matched the $312 million my brother-in-law had bled out of the company over 36 months, right down to the $928 monthly administrative fee funneled through a joint account I had never known existed in my own name. Page 47 showed my electronic signature, forged so cleanly that even my own forensic accountant later admitted he would have missed it without the metadata. Page 112 contained screenshots from my daughter's private Instagram account, bragging to her Dubai circle about the new villa in the hills that Daddy's bonus had paid for. Page 189 was a copy of the irrevocable trust my children had quietly established 6 months earlier, naming themselves as sole beneficiaries and listing my Houston estate as collateral in case I ever needed long-term care. They had not waited for me to die. They had prepared the paperwork while I was still signing their Amex bills. I sat on the edge of my king bed with those pages scattered across the duvet like yellowed receipts from a life I no longer recognized. The stale perfume of my ex-wife's old cardigan still lingered in the closet, even though she had been gone for 8 years. I could smell it now, mixing with the fresh paint from the guest wing I had just remodeled for my son's visits that would never come. That was the moment the cold fury settled in. Not rage, not tears, just the crystalline realization that my own blood had treated me like an ATM with an expiration date. I did not call my children. I did not scream at my lawyers. Instead, I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had not used in 15 years. Marcus Hale, the most ruthless forensic accountant on the East Coast, the man who once dismantled a $2.7 billion hedge fund over a single misplaced decimal. I told him I had a new client, me, and I wanted every dollar traced, every shell company unwound, every signature authenticated. Marcus arrived 2 days later with a team of 3. They set up in my dining room, yellow legal pads and dual monitors turning the mahogany table into a war room. Within 72 hours, they had confirmed what Ethan already knew. My brother-in-law had used my power of attorney, granted years earlier for emergency travel documents, to execute the deed transfers on 3 waterfront parcels I thought were still in my sole name. The Galveston terminal itself had a quiet lien filed against it by a Delaware LLC controlled by my son-in-law. The paper trail was surgical. It was also sloppy in the one place that mattered. They had never expected the intern they dismissed as a nobody to notice. While Marcus's team worked, I began my own silent setup. I reactivated the Ring cameras I had installed around the estate the year before, the ones my daughter had laughed at and called paranoid. I started recording every voicemail my children left when they thought I was too drunk to answer. I pulled every bank statement for the last 5 years and fed them into a private data room I opened under a new LLC in Nevada, far outside their reach. I even had my pilot fly me to Austin under a false name so I could sit in the back of a public library and watch Ethan defend his senior thesis on advanced process optimization. The same thesis that had apparently included a side project modeling vapor loss economics at mid-sized Gulf Coast refineries. The kid had been building the weapon while fetching my coffee. By mid-January, the SEC had issued a formal Wells notice. My board, the same men who had toasted me at last year's holiday party, voted 4-1 to place me on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The one dissenting vote came from the only director who had never taken a dime from my brother-in-law. He resigned the next day rather than watch what was coming. I did not fight the leave. I used the time. Marcus delivered his preliminary report on Valentine's Day, 68 pages of color tabs and exhibits. He sat across from me in the study, half-empty bourbon glass between us, and laid it out in the flat, unemotional tone of a man who had seen worse. Your family extracted $312 million through layered related party transactions. They used your power of attorney to execute unauthorized deed transfers totaling $184 million in real estate. They established an irrevocable trust that would have stripped you of control the moment any doctor signed a mental competency evaluation they planned to shop for in Tehran. And they did it all while you were still signing the checks. He paused, then added the line that sealed it. But here is the beautiful part, Darius. Every document they forged or backdated carries a digital timestamp that ties straight back to IP addresses registered to your daughter's MacBook and your son-in-law's VPN in Dubai. Ethan Caldwell handed us the rope. We just have to tie the noose. I smiled for the first time in months. Not a warm smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. I instructed Marcus to prepare a full forensic package for the DOJ, the IRS, and the Texas Attorney General. I also authorized him to file a civil suit in Harris County District Court alleging financial abuse, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, seeking not just restitution, but punitive damages, and a temporary restraining order barring my children from any contact with me or my remaining assets. The paperwork drop was scheduled for March 11th. That morning, I sat at the head of the long dining table where my family had celebrated every birthday and deal closing for 2 decades. The manila envelopes were stacked in neat piles, one for each of them, labeled with their full legal names. My security system was armed. The Ring doorbell glowed red. Fresh paint still lingered from the room I had already decided to sell. At 10:47 a.m., the doorbell camera caught my daughter's black Range Rover pulling into the circular drive. My son-in-law was behind the wheel. My son arrived 2 minutes later in the Porsche I had co-signed for him last Christmas. They let themselves in with the keys they still thought belonged to them. They found me exactly where I wanted them to, seated at the table, bourbon untouched, the envelopes waiting like execution orders. My daughter started first, voice already rising into that familiar tone of entitled outrage. She demanded to know why her Amex had been declined at Neiman Marcus the night before, why the trust attorneys in Tehran were suddenly ghosting her, why the villa deposit had bounced. I let her speak until the words ran dry. Then I slid the first envelope across the polished wood. This is a copy of the civil complaint filed this morning in Harris County. You have been named personally along with your husband and brother. The court has already granted a temporary restraining order preventing any of you from accessing or disposing of any asset traceable to Voss Petrochem or to me. Your joint accounts are frozen. Your passports have been flagged with Homeland Security, and the FBI would like to speak with all 3 of you about sanctions violations. My son-in-law reached for his phone. I watched the screen light up with the notification that his VPN account had just been suspended for suspicious activity. My son tried the gaslighting route, voice cracking as he called me paranoid, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that family doesn't do this to family. I cut him off with the quiet precision of a man who had finally stopped being their walking ATM. You stopped being my family the day you forged my signature on a trust that would have put me in a nursing home while you liquidated everything I built. Ethan Caldwell simply showed me the receipts. The silence that followed was thicker than the stale perfume still clinging to the cardigan in my closet. My daughter lunged for the envelope, manicured nails tearing at the seal. When she saw the 214 pages of bank records with her own Instagram posts highlighted in yellow, the color drained from her face exactly the way Ethan's had the day I fired him. I stood up slowly, buttoned my jacket, and walked to the front door. The security system beeped once as I armed it from the panel. You have 30 days to vacate any property still titled in my name. After that, the eviction notices will be served by the sheriff. Do not call. Do not text. Do not send your flying monkeys with sob stories. The next time you see my face will be across a courtroom. I opened the door. The March wind carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and distant refinery flares. My daughter screamed something about blood and betrayal, voice echoing off the marble foyer. My son-in-law tried one last threat about what their lawyers in Tehran would do. My son just stood there, mouth open, the Porsche keys dangling uselessly from his fingers. I did not answer. I simply watched them file out, the red light of the Ring doorbell blinking steadily above us, recording every second for the permanent record. As the last car disappeared down the driveway, I closed the heavy oak door and stood in the sudden quiet of a house that finally felt like mine again. The empire was gone. The $1 billion was never coming back. But for the first time in my life, I was no longer anyone's walking ATM. And somewhere, Ethan Caldwell was probably checking the new share price on his phone, smiling that same quiet smile. Because the kid I fired in 47 seconds had just taught a 67-year-old billionaire the most expensive lesson of his life. Never fire the wrong intern. The courthouse in downtown Houston smelled of fresh floor wax and old paper on the morning of April 2nd, 2024. The kind of sterile institutional scent that clings to every federal building where fortunes are dismantled one affidavit at a time. I sat in the back row of the hearing room in a dark suit that no longer felt like armor, watching the magistrate judge flip through the stack of exhibits Marcus Hale had prepared. The manila envelope I had personally handed my daughter 3 weeks earlier now lay open on the plaintiff's table like a wound that refused to close. My children and their spouses occupied the defense side, flanked by 3 attorneys who looked as if they had billed my family's remaining credit lines just to show up. The temporary restraining order had already done its work. Overnight, the joint accounts holding the last $41.3 million in liquid assets were locked under a court-ordered asset freeze. The deed transfers on the 3 waterfront parcels were stayed pending full forensic review. My son-in-law's Dubai VPN logs had been subpoenaed and matched to the timestamps on every forged signature. Even the Range Rover my daughter had been driving sat in my driveway now, keys surrendered under the terms of the order, its black paint gleaming under the estate's security lights like a trophy I no longer wanted. Marcus took the stand first. He spoke in that flat, forensic tone I had come to rely on, walking the court through 1,247 pages of bank wires, shell company filings, and metadata that proved my family had treated Voss Petrochem as their personal piggy bank for 36 straight months. He highlighted the $928 monthly administrative fee that had quietly funneled into a joint account I had never authorized. He displayed the irrevocable trust documents my children had executed 6 months earlier, complete with the mental competency evaluation they had already lined up with a compliant doctor in Tehran. He even produced the power of attorney renewal they had backdated using my own scanned signature from a 2019 travel document. I watched my daughter's face as each slide went up on the courtroom monitor. The entitled outrage she had hurled at me in my foyer had curdled into something smaller, something frightened. She whispered frantically to her attorney, who kept shaking his head because there was nothing left to argue. My son-in-law stared at his hands as if they might still type a wire transfer that could fix this. My son simply sat there, the Porsche he could no longer afford parked somewhere in a lot that would soon send him a lien notice. The judge did not need long. By 11:17 a.m., he signed the preliminary injunction expanding the freeze to every asset traceable to the related party transactions. He also granted my petition for a forensic accountant to be appointed at the defendant's expense and ordered my children to produce every device they owned for imaging within 72 hours. The bailiff handed each of them a fresh manila envelope containing the expanded order. The red blinking light on the Ring camera I had installed at the courthouse entrance caught them walking out, shoulders hunched, voices low as they called their flying monkeys back in Tehran for help that would never arrive in time. I did not follow them. I stayed in the hallway long enough to watch the next phase unfold on my phone. The SEC enforcement team had synchronized their own filings that same morning. A parallel civil forfeiture action landed against the Bahamian entity my brother-in-law had used to cycle the $87.4 million. Within hours, the FBI executed search warrants on the Houston office my son-in-law still thought was safe. Agents carried out boxes of hard drives, while my daughter stood on the sidewalk in designer heels, screaming at the sky that this was all a misunderstanding orchestrated by a disgruntled intern. She was half right. Ethan had lit the match. I had simply poured the gasoline. Back at the estate that evening, the dining table once again became command central. Marcus's team had doubled in size. Yellow legal pads covered the mahogany while fresh paint dried in the guest wing I had already listed for sale. I poured a single bourbon and listened to the beep of the security system arming itself automatically at dusk. Voicemail after voicemail played on speaker from numbers I had blocked, but Marcus's software still captured. My daughter begging for access to the trust. My son-in-law threatening to expose family secrets to the Iranian authorities. My son offering to sign anything if I would just unfreeze the Amex. I let every message play to the end, then deleted them without answering. The cold fury had crystallized into something cleaner now, something surgical. I authorized Marcus to file the next motion. A request for receivership over the remaining Voss Petrochem shares still in my name, and a guardianship petition to prevent my children from ever again seeking control of my affairs. The paperwork would land on their lawyers' desks by Friday. 3 days later, the real fracture appeared. My daughter showed up unannounced at the estate gate, mascara already running, claiming she had proof that Ethan had fabricated half the evidence. Security turned her away under the terms of the restraining order, but the Ring doorbell recorded every word she shouted into the camera. Accusations of paranoia, claims that I was the one who had enabled the siphoning, promises that blood was thicker than any court order. I watched the footage later that night while the half-empty bourbon glass sat on the counter beside me, the stale perfume from my ex-wife's old cardigan somehow stronger in the empty house. Marcus called at 9:42 p.m. The imaging of my children's devices had yielded gold. Hidden in an encrypted folder on my son-in-law's laptop were wallet addresses for $19.7 million in cryptocurrency moved through a shell company in Singapore just 2 weeks before I fired Ethan. The transfers matched the exact dates of the last unauthorized deed filings. The forensic chain was now ironclad. The DOJ added wire fraud and money laundering counts to the existing sanctions investigation before midnight. I slept 4 hours that night, the deepest rest I had managed since the first manila envelope arrived. When I woke, Bloomberg was already running the story. Voss Petrochem equity receiver appointed, trading halted pending restructuring, former CEO and family facing expanded federal probe. The share price I no longer owned had dropped another 23% on the news. By the end of the week, the sheriff's deputies had taped eviction notices to the doors of the 2 remaining properties still titled in my children's names, but funded by company assets. My daughter's villa deposit in Tehran was clawed back under international mutual legal assistance. My son's Porsche was repossessed from the dealership lot where he had tried to trade it in for cash. The flying monkeys they sent, Old business associates who owed me favors from the tanker days received their own subpoenas and promptly vanished. I stood on the second-floor balcony of the Houston estate that Sunday afternoon, watching the fountains run for what felt like the first time in years. The March wind carried the distant flare of the refineries I had once commanded. Somewhere in the system, Ethan Caldwell's whistleblower award was already being calculated, a percentage of the $312 million restitution the court would eventually order my family to pay. I did not need to speak to him to know he was watching the same numbers. The empire was gone. The $1 billion had evaporated into legal fees, forfeitures, and court-ordered repayments. My own children had become defendants in their father's civil suit, their names now permanently linked to financial abuse and sanctions violations in every public database that mattered. And yet, for the first time since I had watched Ethan walk out of my bullpen with that quiet, recalibrated look on his face, I felt something close to balance. The paperwork had done what no amount of screaming or gaslighting ever could. It had severed the last cord. The final courtroom collapse unfolded on a sweltering May morning in 2024 inside the Harris County Civil District Court, the same building where my family had once celebrated a $240 million credit line victory with catered sushi in the atrium. This time, the only thing being served was their own undoing. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Marcus Hale while my children and their spouses huddled on the opposite side with a rotating cast of 4 different attorneys who had already burned through the last of the unfrozen cash. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had seen every flavor of financial abuse in her 23 years on the bench, reviewed the latest stack of exhibits with the detached precision of a surgeon reading an X-ray. Marcus had not wasted the 72-hour device imaging window. The forensic package now included 2,314 pages of fresh evidence, cryptocurrency wallet addresses traced through blockchain analytics firms in Austin, $19.7 million in stablecoins that had bounced through 3 Singapore shell companies before landing in my son-in-law's personal brokerage. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the backdated power of attorney renewals. Even better, the imaging captured deleted text threads where my daughter and son coordinated the mental competency evaluation shopping spree, complete with screenshots of the Tehran doctor's fee schedule paid from the same joint account they had forged my signature to open. The judge did not entertain oral arguments for long. By 10:34 a.m., she issued the permanent injunction, converting the temporary asset freeze into a full receivership over every remaining Voss Petrochem share still titled in my name. She also granted my guardianship petition in full, stripping my children of any future ability to seek control over my affairs or assets. A court-appointed guardian ad litem would now oversee my financial decisions for the next 36 months. A polite way of saying I had legally divorced my own blood. The final line of the order was the one that landed like a gavel to the chest. All defendants jointly and severally liable for $312 million in restitution, plus $47.8 million in punitive damages and the full cost of forensic accounting, to be paid within 90 days or face contempt proceedings and asset liquidation auctions. My daughter tried one last desperate gambit right there in open court. She stood up, voice trembling but still laced with that practiced entitlement, claiming I had suffered a nervous breakdown after the firing, that Ethan Caldwell had manipulated me with fake data, that family money should stay in the family, and the court was destroying decades of legitimate estate planning. She even produced a letter from the same Tehran doctor they had tried to hire, diagnosing me with early cognitive decline based on a 15-minute Zoom call I had never attended. The judge looked at the letter, then at the metadata Marcus had already flagged, showing the doctor's IP address pinging from Dubai the same day the evaluation was supposedly conducted. She denied the motion to stay the receivership in under 40 seconds. The bailiff slid fresh manila envelopes across the table, this time containing the full receivership order, the contempt warning, and the first set of IRS Form 1099s that would report the restitution as taxable income to my children, whether they paid it or not. I watched them file out into the hallway, the red light of the courthouse security camera catching every defeated step. My son-in-law was already on his phone trying to call contacts in the Cayman Islands who no longer answered. My son stood frozen beside the elevator bank, the keys to the repossessed Porsche long gone, his face the color of the yellowed receipts Marcus had spread across my dining table weeks earlier. My daughter paused at the glass doors, turned back once as if she might scream something about blood and betrayal again. But the permanent restraining order now included a no-contact clause that covered even eye contact in public spaces. She thought better of it and kept walking. Back at the estate that afternoon, I made the final preparations myself. The moving crew I had hired under the new LLC finished boxing the last of my personal effects from the master suite. The guest wing, freshly painted and staged, went under contract the same day for $2.9 million to a retired oil executive who had no idea he was buying the first piece of my reconstructed life. I sat on the same dining table where the envelopes had once been stacked, half-empty bourbon glass beside me, and reviewed the final documents Marcus had couriered over. The irrevocable trust my children had tried to weaponize was now dissolved by court order. The deed transfers they had forged were reversed, returning the 3 waterfront parcels to my sole ownership before the receiver auctioned them to satisfy the judgment. Even the $41.3 million still trapped in the frozen joint accounts would be clawed back as disgorgement, with the forensic accountant's final bill of $184,000 sent directly to my daughter's former Amex address. I authorized one last filing, a motion to unseal the entire case record so that every sanctions violation, every wire fraud count, and every instance of financial abuse would live forever in the public PACER database. No more hiding behind Tehran lawyers or Dubai VPNs. The flying monkeys they had sent in the final weeks, old tanker captains and former board members who suddenly remembered they owed me favors, received their own subpoenas and melted away like morning fog over the Gulf. At 6:17 p.m., the Ring doorbell camera lit up one final time. My daughter's black Range Rover, now titled back to the receivership and driven by a court-appointed deputy, pulled into the circular drive. She was not behind the wheel. She stood on the passenger side with a single suitcase, mascara streaked, trying to wave down the security guard as if the restraining order had magically dissolved overnight. My son and son-in-law waited in a rented sedan behind her, engine idling, faces blank with the realization that the $312 million judgment was now accruing interest at 8.25% per annum, and that the IRS had already placed liens on every account they still controlled. I did not open the door. I simply armed the security system from the panel inside, the familiar beep echoing through the now empty foyer. The deputy handed each of them their copy of the eviction notice, 30 days to vacate any remaining properties, sheriff enforcement guaranteed. I watched the footage on my phone as the cars pulled away for the last time, taillights disappearing down the driveway while the fountains kept running like nothing had changed. The stale perfume of my ex-wife's old cardigan had finally been boxed and donated. The yellow legal pads were gone. The only thing left on the dining table was a single printed email from the SEC confirming Ethan Caldwell's whistleblower award calculation had been approved, a percentage of the recovered assets that would fund the rest of his life without ever touching mine. I poured the last of the bourbon down the sink, walked to the front door, and stood in the sudden quiet of a house that no longer belonged to anyone but me. The empire had been reduced to court filings and auction notices. The billion-dollar mistake of firing one intern had cost me everything I once measured my worth by. But I was no longer anyone's walking ATM, no longer the target of forged signatures or backdated trusts or mental competency evaluations bought and paid for with my own money. I closed the heavy oak door behind me, locked it with the new set of keys the receiver had issued, and stepped into the humid Houston evening with nothing but a carry-on, and the quiet, recalibrated smile I had borrowed from the kid I had once escorted out of my bullpen. The paperwork had spoken. The family that tried to bury me was now the one being buried under it, And for the first time in 67 years, I was finally completely free. The summer of 2024 bled into a crisp Texas fall while I settled into a 3,200 square foot waterfront condo on the quieter side of Galveston. Purchased outright with the $214 million slice of personal assets the guardian ad litem had surgically carved out before the final receivership auction. No fountains, no guest wing reeking of fresh paint for visitors who would never come. Just clean glass walls overlooking the Gulf, a single home office, and a security system whose arming beep sounded sharper, more final than anything that had ever echoed through the old Houston estate. Marcus Hale delivered the last forensic update on a Tuesday morning, his voice as flat and precise as the spreadsheets he lived inside. The court-ordered restitution had begun flowing. $8.4 million wired from the forced liquidation of my daughter's Dubai villa. Another $12.7 million clawed from my son-in-law's frozen Singapore holdings, and a fresh $3.9 million from the auction of the 3 waterfront parcels they had tried to steal with forged deed transfers. The IRS had already issued the 1099s, treating every dollar as taxable income to them personally. Their Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing in Harris County had been pierced within 48 hours under the federal sanctions overlay, leaving them jointly and severally liable for the full $359.8 million judgment, plus daily interest at 8.25%. The guardian ad litem had also approved the final dissolution of the irrevocable trust they had set up in Tehran, returning every remaining beneficiary designation to the court-appointed receiver. They tried one final pathetic gambit in early October. A plain manila envelope arrived at the new condo address via a courier service my daughter had paid for with what must have been her last functioning credit line. Inside was a handwritten letter signed by all 3 of them, the words dripping with the same gaslighting poison they had perfected over 36 months. Claims of regret, accusations that Ethan Caldwell had poisoned my mind, promises to repay every cent if I would only drop the remaining, contempt motions and allow them back into my life as family. They even included a notarized offer to sign over their remaining personal interests in exchange for a private settlement outside the receivership. I read it once in the morning light, the salt air drifting through the open balcony doors, then fed the pages into the industrial shredder beside my desk. The guardian ad litem received a scanned copy the same afternoon, along with a new motion for restraining order violation. The sheriff delivered the updated paperwork to their temporary rental addresses within 48 hours. No flying monkeys arrived after that. No more tearful voicemails. The permanent no-contact order now carried the explicit threat of immediate incarceration, and they finally understood the paperwork was no longer negotiable. The circle closed for good on a quiet November afternoon when Bloomberg ran a short feature on successful Dodd-Frank whistleblowers. There, in a sidebar photograph taken outside the Texas A&M commencement hall, was Ethan Caldwell in cap and gown, the same quiet, recalibrated smile on his face. The article noted that his award had been calculated at $29.4 million after taxes, and that he had already launched a compliance analytics startup focused on vapor loss modeling and sanctions screening software. 3 mid-sized Gulf Coast refineries had signed on as first clients, each paying 7 figures to avoid the exact governance failures that had dismantled Voss Petrochem. He had donated half the award to an endowment for engineering interns who could not afford unpaid summers. I closed the laptop and stepped onto the balcony, letting the Gulf breeze carry away the last ghosts of stale perfume and bourbon that had once clung to every surface of my old life. The Ring doorbell on the new front entrance blinked its steady red light, but the only visitor scheduled was a delivery of fresh legal pads for the small private investment vehicle I had quietly formed under a Nevada LLC. My first portfolio focused on clean process optimization tech, the very models Ethan had been building while fetching my coffee. My first hire was a forensic accountant Marcus recommended. My first intern, a quiet 22-year-old from A&M who asked sharp questions but never presumed to know more than decades of experience, received full read-only access to every simulation on day one, because I had finally learned the difference between control and paranoia. The old empire was gone. The billion-dollar valuation had evaporated into court fees, forfeitures, and auction proceeds. My children were now defendants whose names lived forever in the public PACER database, alongside terms like financial abuse, wire fraud, and sanctions violations. They would spend the next decade chasing garnishments and dodging contempt hearings, while I watched the Gulf from a home no one could ever forge a deed against. I poured the last unopened bottle of bourbon down the kitchen sink that evening, watching the amber liquid swirl away like the final yellowed receipt from a life I no longer recognized. The security system beeped once as I armed it for the night. The sound was clean, decisive, mine alone. Somewhere out there, Ethan Caldwell was probably checking the same Bloomberg terminal, building something honest with the payout he had earned by noticing what I had refused to see. I did not need to speak to him to know the lesson had landed exactly as intended. The paperwork had not merely taken my empire, it had severed the last cord to the blood that tried to drain it dry. No reconciliation letters, no holiday phone calls, no deathbed scenes where forgiveness magically appeared. The boundaries were court-ordered, ironclad, and permanent. I stood in the sudden quiet of the new condo, the salt air replacing every stale scent of the past, and felt something I had not experienced in 67 years. Complete, unburdened freedom. The billion-dollar mistake of firing one American college kid had cost me everything I once measured my worth by. It had also given me back the only thing worth keeping: myself. By spring of 2025, the Galveston condo had become the only home I recognized. The Gulf stretched out beyond the glass walls each morning like a balance sheet finally reconciled. No hidden liabilities, no forged signatures waiting in the next drawer. I had wired the last $47.2 million of court-ordered restitution into my new Nevada LLC the week before, bringing the total clawed back from my children's frozen accounts and liquidated assets to $359.8 million, plus every penny of accrued interest. The Chapter 7 bankruptcy they had filed in desperation was pierced for the third time by the federal court, the judge citing ongoing sanctions violations and intentional financial abuse as grounds to deny discharge. Their names now sat permanently in the PACER database alongside terms like wire fraud, money laundering, and breach of fiduciary duty, a public record no Tehran lawyer or Dubai VPN could ever scrub. I launched Voss Sentinel Analytics on the first business day of April with $18.4 million in seed capital from the Guardian ad litem approved carve-out and a single office suite 2 blocks from the old Houston headquarters I no longer owned. The business plan was simple and surgical. AI-driven compliance software that modeled vapor loss economics, sanctions screening, and related party transaction flags in real time. The irony was not lost on me. I had hired 3 former Texas A&M engineers, none of them interns who thought they knew more than decades of experience, and given every one of them full read-only access to the beta platform from day one. The first 3 mid-sized Gulf Coast refiners signed 7-figure contracts within 6 weeks, each citing the exact governance failures that had dismantled my old empire as the reason they were willing to pay premium rates for prevention. Marcus Hale ran the forensic audit division of the new venture himself. On the morning of the official launch, he slid a single manila envelope across my new conference table, this one containing the final receivership report on Voss Petrochem. The company now traded under new ownership at $62.14 a share, up 34% year-over-year on improved compliance metrics and 0 related party red flags. My brother-in-law's shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Dubai had been dissolved by court order. The irrevocable trust my children had tried to weaponize was reduced to ash in the public record. Even the power of attorney they had abused for deed transfers had been revoked with prejudice, the judge's order explicitly barring any family member from ever seeking guardianship or mental competency evaluations against me again. I did not celebrate with bourbon. I had poured the last bottle down the sink months earlier. Instead, I stood on the condo balcony that evening, salt air replacing every stale trace of the past, and let the numbers settle like a final ledger entry. My daughter and son-in-law were now living in a two-bedroom rental in a modest Houston suburb, their Range Rover and Porsche long auctioned off to satisfy the judgment. My son had taken a job managing inventory at a small chemical distributor, the kind of position that came with a drug test and no signing authority. Their flying monkeys had scattered after the last contempt motion landed, the threat of jail time for violating the permanent restraining order proving far more persuasive than any blood-tie plea. The reflection hit me hardest in the quiet hours. For 67 years, I had measured loyalty by DNA instead of data. I had treated my own children as automatic beneficiaries, signing whatever documents they placed in front of me, approving wire transfers without forensic review, granting power of attorney like it was a casual favor rather than a loaded weapon. That blind trust had cost me $4.2 billion, my reputation, and the company I had built tanker by tanker from the Persian Gulf. They had gaslighted me for 36 straight months, siphoning $312 million through layered shell companies while I still paid their Amex bills and co-signed their luxury leases. They had prepared the mental competency evaluation and the nursing home paperwork while I was still healthy enough to fire an intern who dared question my loading schedules. Firing Ethan Caldwell had been the single smartest mistake of my life. The kid I escorted out with security guards had simply refused to stay blind. He had used public filings, AIS data, and 6 weeks of obsessive work to expose what my own blood had spent years hiding. The paperwork he triggered did not scream or cry or beg for reconciliation. It simply arrived in manila envelopes and court orders, cold, precise, and unstoppable. It severed every cord without a single tearful voicemail or holiday phone call. No deathbed scenes, no cheap forgiveness, just ironclad boundaries enforced by Harris County sheriffs and federal receivers. I checked the Bloomberg terminal one last time before arming the security system for the night. Voss Sentinel Analytics had already inked a fourth contract, $2.9 million in annual recurring revenue locked in before we even shipped the first module. Ethan's own compliance startup had gone public the month before at a $180 million valuation. I did not reach out to him. I did not need to. The lesson had been delivered in the only language that ever mattered: numbers, timestamps, and irreversible legal filings. The Ring doorbell blinked its steady red light above the front entrance, recording nothing but the Gulf breeze and the distant refinery flares I no longer controlled. The beep of the security system arming itself echoed through the clean, empty condo like a final gavel strike. No yellowed receipts scattered across the dining table. No stale perfume clinging to old cardigans. Just the salt air and the quiet knowledge that every asset, every boundary, and every remaining day belonged to me alone. I had lost an empire to one fired intern. I had gained something far more valuable in return. The freedom that comes when you finally stop treating family like an ATM and start treating paperwork like the only relative you can trust. The billion-dollar mistake had been worth every cent. 1 year later, on a clear April morning in 2026, I stood on the same Galveston balcony watching the Gulf catch the first light, the numbers on my Voss Sentinel Analytics terminal glowing like a verdict that would never be appealed. The company had just closed its Series A at a $147 million valuation, the term sheet signed in the same conference room where Marcus Hale once spread 2,314 pages of forensic exhibits across polished mahogany. Annual recurring revenue sat at $41.7 million. Every contract locked with ironclad governance clauses that flagged related party transactions before the first wire could clear. 3 Fortune 500 refiners had come aboard in the last quarter alone, each paying 7 figures to run the exact sanctions screening and vapor loss models that had once exposed my old empire's fatal flaws. The Guardian ad litem had filed his final report the week before, confirming every remaining asset under my control was clean, irrevocable, and beyond the reach of any future power of attorney or mental competency petition. The $359.8 million restitution judgment against my children had been reduced by forced asset sales to $312 million, still outstanding, interest compounding daily at 8.25%. Their second bankruptcy attempt was denied in federal court last month, the judge citing ongoing wire fraud concealment and the undischargeable nature of sanctions violations. Public PACER records now carried the permanent annotation, financial abuse of parent, with my name redacted for privacy and theirs forever linked to the layered shell companies that had once funneled $87.4 million through Cayman and Dubai fronts. I received no more manila envelopes from them. The permanent restraining order, expanded by the Harris County Court to include electronic contact, had held for 14 straight months. The last attempt, a certified letter routed through a third-party attorney claiming reconciliation in the best interest of family legacy, had triggered an immediate contempt filing. The sheriff served the show cause order at their current rental address in a Houston suburb, the same address where the Range Rover had long since been repossessed and the Porsche keys traded for bus fare. My daughter's social media accounts, once filled with Dubai villa selfies, now showed nothing but private profiles and deactivated Amex-linked posts. My son-in-law's VPN logs, still monitored under the receivership order, had gone dark after the last Dubai account was frozen. My son worked the night shift at the chemical distributor, his name flagged in every employment background check that touched energy sector compliance. I did not call. I did not check. The Ring doorbell on the Galveston condo blinked its steady red light each evening, recording nothing but salt air and the distant refinery flares I no longer owned. The security system beeped once at dusk, arming itself with the new codes only I possessed. No stale perfume lingered in any closet. No yellowed receipts waited on the dining table. The industrial shredder had reduced the final handwritten plea to confetti 6 months earlier, the Guardian ad litem receiving the scanned copy as Exhibit A in the contempt motion. Bloomberg ran a follow-up feature that same week on Dodd-Frank whistleblower outcomes. Ethan Caldwell's compliance startup had hit $412 million in market cap after its first full year public, the vapor loss algorithms now standard in half the Gulf Coast terminals. A sidebar noted that he had quietly endowed a full-ride internship program at Texas A&M, requiring every recipient to sign a personal code of ethics that mirrored the exact governance failures he had once documented in a 112-slide deck. I read the piece once, closed the laptop, and felt the same quiet recalibration I had borrowed from him the day I fired him in 47 seconds. The billion-dollar mistake had not merely cost me an empire, it had recalibrated my entire definition of loyalty. I had spent 67 years treating blood as an automatic beneficiary, granting joint accounts without forensic review, signing deed transfers as casually as birthday cards. My own children had responded by preparing an irrevocable trust that would have stripped me of control the moment a compliant Tehran doctor filed the mental competency evaluation they had already budgeted for. They had backdated power of attorney renewals, routed $312 million through shell companies, and prepared nursing home paperwork while I still co-signed their luxury leases. The paperwork Ethan triggered did not negotiate. It did not gaslight or love bomb or send flying monkeys with sob stories. It simply arrived in court orders and asset freezes, cold, precise, and final. I launched no revenge tour. I issued no public statements. I simply let the receivership auctions run their course. The IRS liens compound, and the permanent no-contact order stand as the only boundary my family would ever respect. The new venture thrived precisely because I had stopped measuring success by DNA and started measuring it by data, by timestamps, by irreversible legal filings. The Gulf breeze carried the faint scent of distant flares as I stepped back inside, arming the security system with a single decisive beep. Voss Sentinel Analytics would report Q2 earnings next month, the first under full independent board oversight. 0 related party red flags guaranteed. My children would wake to another garnishment notice, another day of interest accruing on a judgment they could never outrun. Ethan Caldwell would probably check the same terminal, smile that quiet smile, and move on to the next optimization model. I poured a single glass of water, no bourbon, and stood in the clean quiet of the condo that belonged to no one but me. The empire was gone. The $1 billion had been redistributed by court order into restitution, forensic fees, and new compliance technology that would prevent the next Darius Voss from making the same mistake. And I was finally completely free. Not because family had come to its senses, not because blood proved thicker than water, because the paperwork had spoken louder than any scream, any plea, any forged signature ever could. The $1 billion mistake of firing one American college kid had cost me everything I once measured my worth by. It had also handed me the only inheritance worth keeping, the freedom that comes when you finally stop being anyone's walking ATM and start trusting the only relative that never lies: the law. 2 years later, on a flawless April morning in 2028, I stood on the expanded balcony of the Galveston waterfront property I now owned outright, the Gulf stretching out like a ledger that had finally balanced to 0 with no outstanding debits. Voss. Sentinel Analytics had just reported its third consecutive year of 47% year-over-year growth, closing the quarter at $89.3 million in annual recurring revenue and a $312 million enterprise valuation. The new 18,000-square-foot headquarters sat on the edge of the energy corridor, every server rack and compliance dashboard running the exact vapor loss and sanctions screening algorithms that had once exposed the fatal cracks in my old empire. The board, composed entirely of independent directors with no family ties, had approved the latest $47 million credit facility without a single related party flag or forged signature in sight. Marcus Hale ran the forensic audit division like a precision machine, his latest report confirming 0 unauthorized deed transfers, 0 power of attorney abuses, and 0 attempts at mental competency evaluations since the court-appointed guardian ad litem had closed the file for good 18 months earlier. The manila envelope that arrived at my new address that same week was the last one my children would ever dare send. It came through a third-party courier service they could no longer afford, containing a single notarized motion filed in Harris County requesting modification of the permanent restraining order. The language was the same gaslighting sludge they had perfected years earlier. Claims of reformed family dynamics, offers to repay a token $2.4 million from their remaining bankruptcy estate, and a thinly veiled threat to leak private medical records unless I allowed supervised contact. The sheriff's deputy who hand-delivered my copy of the court's response stood at the front door while the Ring doorbell blinked its steady red light above us. The judge had denied the motion in 43 minutes flat, expanding the no-contact order to include any electronic or third-party proxy communication and imposing an additional $184,000 in sanctions for frivolous filing. The paperwork drop was surgical. The deputy taped the updated order to their rental unit door the same afternoon, 30-day contempt clock already ticking. I watched the footage later that evening from the clean kitchen counter, half-empty water glass beside me, the salt air drifting through the open sliders. No stale perfume clung to any surface. No yellowed receipts littered the table. The industrial shredder reduced their final plea to confetti before the sun set, and the guardian ad litem received the scanned copy as Exhibit A in the new enforcement action. Their Chapter 11 attempt had been converted to Chapter 7 liquidation the month before, the federal court citing ongoing wire fraud concealment and the non-dischargeable $312 million restitution judgment plus $89.4 million in compounded interest. My daughter now worked retail in a strip mall on the outskirts of Houston. Her social media presence reduced to a deactivated account with no Dubai villa selfies left to brag about. My son-in-law's Dubai VPN had been seized under the final forfeiture order, his name flagged in every international banking database from Singapore to the Cayman Islands. My son still clocked night shifts at the chemical distributor, his background check forever carrying the public PACER annotation. Financial abuse of parent, sanctions violations, breach of fiduciary duty. The billion-dollar mistake of firing Ethan Caldwell in July 2023 had not merely cost me Voss Petrochem. It had forced a complete recalibration of every metric I once used to measure loyalty. I had spent decades treating blood as an irrevocable beneficiary, granting joint accounts without forensic review, signing deed transfers as casually as quarterly reports, and approving power of attorney renewals like they were casual favors instead of loaded weapons. My own children had answered that blind trust by siphoning $312 million through layered shell companies, backdating irrevocable trust documents, shopping for a compliant Tehran doctor to sign the mental competency evaluation, and preparing the nursing home paperwork that would have liquidated. Everything while I was still healthy enough to walk into my own boardroom. They had love-bombed me with luxury leases and flying monkey pleas, while the forensic trail of $87.4 million in unauthorized consulting fees grew under their polished fingernails. Ethan had simply refused to stay silent. The kid I had escorted out with security guards in 47 seconds had used public filings, AIS tanker data, and 6 obsessive weeks in a 24-hour Kinko's to build the 112 slide deck and the Dodd-Frank whistleblower submission that triggered the SEC, the DOJ, the IRS, and the Harris County receivership all at once. The paperwork he started did not scream or cry or beg for reconciliation. It arrived in court orders and asset freezes, cold, precise, and unstoppable. It severed every cord without a single tearful voicemail or holiday phone call. No deathbed scenes, no cheap forgiveness. Just ironclad boundaries enforced by sheriffs, federal receivers, and permanent injunctions that my children now feared more than any blood tie. I closed the laptop on the balcony that evening, the Gulf breeze carrying the faint scent of distant refinery flares I no longer controlled. Voss, Sentinel Analytics would report Q2 earnings next month under full independent oversight. 0 related party red flags guaranteed. Ethan Caldwell's own compliance startup had crossed the $1.2 billion market cap threshold the week before. His endowed internship program at Texas A&M now sending a new class of sharp-eyed engineering students into the industry with the same obsessive data discipline he had once turned against me. I did not reach out to him. I did not need to. The lesson had been delivered in the only language that ever mattered: timestamps, bank wires, and irreversible legal filings. The security system beeped once as I armed it for the night, the sound clean and decisive in the empty condo that belonged to no one but me. No more manila envelopes from Tehran lawyers or Dubai shell companies. No more gaslighting about family legacy. The Ring doorbell recorded nothing but the salt air and the quiet knowledge that every asset, every boundary, and every remaining day was mine alone. I had lost an empire to one fired American college kid. I had gained the only inheritance worth keeping, the cold, paperwork-enforced freedom that comes when you finally stop being anyone's walking ATM and start trusting the only relative that never lies, the law. And 2 years after the last courtroom collapse, the billion-dollar mistake still felt like the smartest decision I had ever made. 3 years later, on a flawless April morning in 2030, I stood on the wraparound terrace of the 6,800-square-foot Galveston waterfront compound I had designed and paid for in cash. the Gulf of Mexico glittering like a final reconciled balance sheet under a cloudless sky. Voss Sentinel Analytics had just filed its S-1 for a $1.4 billion IPO, the prospectus clean as the court orders that had dismantled my old life. Annual recurring revenue had climbed to $214 million. Every contract secured with AI-driven related party detection that flagged shell company transfers before the first wire could clear. The independent board, still 0 family members, had approved a $92 million secondary offering with no power of attorney disputes, no forged deed transfers, and no mental competency petitions lurking in the footnotes. Marcus Hale's Forensic Audit Division now employed 42 people and had prevented $1.8 billion in potential governance failures across the Gulf Coast in the last 12 months alone. The final manila envelope arrived at the new address via certified courier on the same day the IPO roadshow kicked off. It came from a bankruptcy trustee in Harris County, not from my children directly. Inside were 47 pages of court filings confirming the permanent conversion of their third bankruptcy attempt into a total asset liquidation. The $312 million restitution judgment, now swollen to $487.4 million, with compounded interest at 8.25%, had consumed every remaining account, every liquidated vehicle, every trace of the Dubai villa and Singapore holdings they had once bragged about on private Instagram stories. The judge's order included a lifetime ban on any future petitions for guardianship, trust modification, or contact through proxies. The expanded permanent restraining order, now carrying federal sanctions overlay, listed every possible loophole and closed it with prejudice. The sheriff had served the final notice at their last known address, a one-bedroom efficiency in a Houston complex where the only luxury left was the weekly bus pass they could no longer afford. I read the documents once on the terrace, the salt air carrying away the last imaginary trace of stale perfume or bourbon that had ever clung to my old life. No yellowed receipts, no half-empty glasses, no desperate voicemails playing on speaker. The Ring doorbell on the reinforced gate blinked its steady red light, recording nothing but the Gulf breeze and the distant refinery flares I had once commanded but no longer needed. I fed the pages into the industrial shredder myself, then forwarded the scanned copy to the Guardian ad litem's office as Exhibit Z in the now closed file. The trustee's cover letter ended with a single line: all avenues of appeal exhausted. No further contact permitted under any circumstances. I did not smile with warmth. I simply noted the finality the way a man notes a cleared lien on a deed. 3 years had passed since the last courtroom collapse, and the paperwork had done exactly what it was engineered to do. My daughter now worked the overnight shift at a 24-hour distribution center, her designer wardrobe reduced to a uniform and a name tag. My son-in-law's international banking flags had followed him into every job application, his VPN history still visible in the public forfeiture records. My son clocked warehouse hours under a different last name he had tried to adopt, only to discover that Pacer annotations do not vanish with a legal name change. The flying monkeys had long since disappeared, the threat of contempt sanctions and IRS garnishments proving far stronger than any blood loyalty they once pretended to carry. No more handwritten pleas, no more gaslighting about family legacy. No more love bombing or threats or Tehran lawyers circling like vultures. The boundaries were not emotional. They were court-ordered, ironclad, and permanent. I had lost an empire worth $4.2 billion to one fired American college kid in 47 seconds. Ethan Caldwell had simply refused to accept the role of disposable intern. He had used public data, 6 obsessive weeks, and a $1,200 Delaware LLC to trigger the SEC, the DOJ, the IRS, and the Harris County receivership in a single elegant chain reaction. The irrevocable trust my children had prepared, the forged power of attorney renewals, the backdated deed transfers, the mental competency evaluation they had already budgeted for, Every layer of financial abuse had been peeled back by timestamps, bank wires, and blockchain trails they never thought nobody would notice. The paperwork had not negotiated. It had not cried. It had not forgiven. It had simply arrived in manila envelopes and asset freezes until the last cord was severed. Voss Sentinel Analytics went public the following week at $68.40 a share. The opening bell rang on the NYSE while I watched from the Galveston Terrace, the security system beeping once as I armed it for the day. Bloomberg ran a short sidebar on the original whistleblower who had sparked the entire restructuring. Ethan's compliance startup had crossed $2.9 billion in market cap, and his endowed internship program at Texas A&M was now sending 24 sharp-eyed students into the industry each year, each one required to memorize the exact governance failures that had cost me everything. I did not reach out. I did not need to. The lesson had been delivered in the only currency that ever mattered: irreversible legal filings and numbers that never lied. I stood there as the sun climbed higher, the Gulf breeze replacing every stale scent of the past. The empire I once measured my worth by was gone, redistributed by court order into restitution, forensic fees, and technology that would prevent the next blind patriarch from making the same mistake. My children were now permanent footnotes in the public record, their names linked forever to financial abuse of parent, wire fraud, sanctions violations, and breach of fiduciary duty. They would spend the rest of their lives dodging garnishments and explaining the PACER annotations to every background check. And I was finally, completely free. Not because blood came to its senses, not because family proved thicker than water, because the paperwork had spoken louder than any scream, any plea, any forged signature ever could. The billion-dollar mistake of firing one American college kid had cost me everything I once measured my worth by. It had also handed me the only inheritance that could never be stolen, forged, or backdated: myself. The security system beeped again as I stepped inside, the sound clean, decisive, and mine alone. The gulf stretched out behind me, endless and reconciled. The story was over. The justice was complete. And the walking ATM had finally closed its account forever.